All right, if you could take your seats, let me just give a very quick introduction to our first keynote speaker this morning. He is Brad Miller, a member of Congress for 5 terms and a champion of financial reform and accountability, something dear to my heart as a former member of the staff of the Banking Committee, as it then was in the House of Representatives. And he has, in the years since, been following the same path from the standpoint of a legal position here in Washington, D.C. So with great pleasure, let me welcome Congressman Brad Miller.
Good morning. One of the peculiarities of serving in Congress is that you are frequently invited to address groups either here in Washington or back home and asked to speak about the issue that they are most concerned about, which really means that what they live and breathe, you've had a chance to read maybe a 3-page briefing paper that your staff prepared before you speak to them. So frequently, I never quite got over the oddity of speaking to a group that hung on every word I said when I was clearly the one in the room who knew the least about it. And so I generally try to avoid explaining things to people who clearly know it better than I do. When I do that, it is because I've forgotten momentarily who I'm talking to. I talked to Elizabeth Warren a few years ago, 3 or 4 years ago, and said that if the rule of law had been applied in the same way to the financial institutions involved in mortgage securitization that had been applied to the asbestos industry, the building supplies industry, we would have had a very different result. The leading building supply manufacturer 30 or 40 years ago was Johns Manville. It is still Johns Manville, but it is a different corporation. The corporation went into bankruptcy. All of the assets were sold, including the trade name Johns Manville, but it came out of bankruptcy with entirely different owners. And she nodded in agreement as I explained that, and later I realized, I explained bankruptcy to Elizabeth Warren. If any of you don't know, before she went into politics, she was the nation's leading bankruptcy scholar. What I think I can, so I'm not going to explain how the deficits are just defile everything that is holy, although that point of view does not stand me in good stead in North Carolina, where Erskine Bowles is considered an iconic figure. I will not try to explain how basic consumer services can be provided in post offices, but I'll try to speak to something that I think probably I do know the most in the room about, and that is how politics works, how people get to Congress, how Congress works, how members of Congress learn or don't learn issues. I was elected in an old-fashioned way. I was not selected from Washington by consultants based upon some set of characteristics like central casting. I think this year, most years are looking for Iraqi war vets or someone with specific characteristics. I was a lawyer who had been in the state legislature. Those are the kind of folks who used to get elected to Congress, and I guess still sometimes do. And my experience in the legislature was with, and this is probably not just a difference in time, but a difference in place, but a difference in time. It was consensus driven. There was the expectation that things would be compromised, not but in a pretty wholesome way. There was the expectation that everyone would literally get in a room together and talk it out and see if they could reach common ground. And the example that I remember, I was frequently assigned the task of sitting in, the task by the leadership, of sitting in any issue on the negotiations over any issues that affected the environment, because the environmentalists knew I was with them in my heart, but I would also tell them when I thought they had the losing side of an argument. And we were in negotiations over how to address abandoned, orphaned, leaking underground storage tanks. And I thought the leaking underground storage tanks issue might be interesting because the acronym made it sound that way. But that that proved not to be the case. But the conversation got heated at one point. And the guy who was there, who owned a convenience store or something from the petroleum retailers, got exasperated and said, look, I'm sitting here and I'm going to work through this, but if you guys really irritate me, I may just go home because I don't have that much at stake. We don't have that much at stake. People need to buy petroleum products. People are not going to stop buying petroleum products, whatever you do. And if you apply a law, it applies to all of us, and my competitors are going to have to pass along the same cost I have to apply to. I have to apply, pass along. I have to pass along. So I don't really have that much at stake. And I looked around the room, and everybody's nodding. Everybody's head was nodding. They agreed with that. That was true. And when I came to Washington, I thought it would be that way here. I had an early conversation with Marion Barry. Not Marion Barry, the drug-addicted former mayor of Washington, but Marion Barry, who was then a congressman and a good old boy from Arkansas. And Marion explained how he got into politics. Marion didn't start out in politics. He was a rice farmer. He was a big rice farmer. They grow a whole lot of rice in Arkansas, and Marion and his brother were the state's two largest rice farmers. Bill Clinton, then governor, proposed legislation on water use. Well, rice farming uses an ungodly amount of water. And Marion and his brother didn't like the bill. So they went down to Arkansas, to Little Rock, they talked to the legislature, they killed it. 2 years later, Bill Clinton introduced the same bill. Marion and his brother went to Little Rock, killed it again. And then he got a call from Bill Clinton. It said, okay, you beat me twice, but one of these years I'm going to get that bill passed, and you're not going to like it because you will not have had a thing to say about what's in that bill. Now, if you come down here to Little Rock and talk to me, maybe we can work it out. And Marion did, and they worked it out. And Marion and Bill Clinton became fast friends. And I thought, I can do this. I know how to do this. I was wrong. Washington could not be more different from the North Carolina legislature when I was in the legislature there, or from Arkansas politics when Marion Barry was wheeling and dealing with Bill Clinton. It is just fundamentally different. One thing is, unlike the petroleum retailers, the people who really lobby Congress are not doing something that has to be done. They're not providing a necessary good or service. They're in many cases doing something that is useless or worse, that is just extractive. And they aren't affected by market forces. They're not affected by supply and demand. There is no regulation by the marketplace, by the market. And second, it all is just about money. Some of you may know Art Wilmarth, who's a law professor at American. GW, okay. He's a law, well, Bob knows him better than I do. But he wrote a long law review article. Art was just appalled at how many things Wall Street got passed when their arguments for those made no sense at all. And it was probably a 70-page law review article. I didn't read the whole article. I read the summary that, law review articles are kind of hard to read, painful to read. And the summary, and I've talked to Art about it, was that it was all because of money. Art, where have you been? How have you not figured that out? When I was first appointed to the Financial Services Committee, I would, as based upon my experience in the legislature in North Carolina, I would sit down and listen to anybody want to come talk to me. And so I would hear the pitches from the Wall Street lobbyist. And I got to the point where only some issues, like that obscure issue that I picked as my own to understand, subprime mortgage lending, I could tell when what people were telling me made no sense at all. And that was frequently, if not always, the case when the lobbyists came to talk to me about subprime mortgage lending. But when it came time for the committee hearing, or the committee meeting, member after member would just puff themselves up and repeat almost word for word the talking points that I had just heard in my office that I knew were nonsense. And I would look out to the back of the room where the lobbyists sat and see the lobbyists nodding with solemn approval that, yes, this is a member who has a sophisticated understanding of the complex topic. And that was about when I decided that gravitas was just Latin for pomposity. And that was what the debate was like in Congress. It was remarkably shallow. It was remarkably uninformed. And the truth was, people did not really want to be informed. That was not how they saw their job. And I wonder if it was different, Jamie, when it was different. Well, that's somewhat reassuring and somewhat discouraging. That's simply not the way it works now. And you probably have, you probably are wondering, how are these dumbasses really running the government? And the answer is no, they're not. But the problem is that the people who are running the government are perhaps worse. I assumed when the financial crisis hit, we got a new administration in the 2008 election, beginning of 2009, that it would be like the New Deal. My father-in-law my late father-in-law was very bookish, so I inherited a lot of his old books, and he actually has a PhD in history. And I got the multi-volume Arthur Schlesinger books on the New Deal, on Franklin Roosevelt. So I took down and started reading the coming of the New Deal. And I'd say by February or March of 2009, I thought, I am reading the wrong book. So I went back and read the one before that, The Crisis of the Old Order, which was about the Great Depression and what led to the 1932 election. And that seemed to be much more apt to the circumstances I was dealing with. Noam Schreiber, who is now I think a reporter for the New York Times, but was a reporter for New Republic, wrote a profile of Valerie Jarrett. And he described the Obama administration in the early going. He said the Clinton alumni Obama initially hired to run his White House and hash out his economic policy were flamboyantly centrist, fanatical about winning over financial markets and moderate voters. In their view, a Democratic president could make no bigger mistake than becoming a captive of the left, and they acted as if they owned the place. Well, I know pretty well, or knew pretty well, Obama's initial chief of staff, Rahm Emanuel, and if Rahm Emanuel was picking people and telling them how to act, that's pretty much who he would have picked and how he would have told them how they would have told him to act. It is not that they lack native intelligence. It is not that they didn't go to good schools. It is not that they didn't get good grades. It is not that they weren't accomplished. They were partners at prestigious national law firms. They had gold on the resume, all over the resume. They were partners at prestigious investment banks. The problem was not lack of IQ. It was the culture, the fundamental understanding of who should win, who should not win, and how things should be decided. And they took it as a given that if you did not agree with them, it was because you lacked the sophisticated understanding. That decisions about the economy, how it is organized, who benefits, who loses, really should be decided by bloodless technocrats, not by some mouth-breathing politicians from the provinces, which were, as I've just said, in fairness, dumbasses. But what they did instead, their assumption unchallenged assumption was that the most important thing to do in the aftermath of the financial crisis was to get the banks back to health, to help them pretend to be solvent until they really were, and that if 10 million families needed to lose their homes to foreclosure, rather than approach that problem with the kind of imagination and urgency that the New Deal approached that problem, that would be, it's unfortunate, but it was not unthinkable. Having major Wall Street institutions collapse, that was unthinkable. Now, that's probably you probably thought that was a pretty grim portrayal of Washington policymaking. And you are wondering what's the point of sitting up here and giving your presentations, your very scholarly presentations on what policies should be. And I can't promise you everything is going to be okay. I think that the best opportunity we had, a remarkable opportunity we had in 2008 and 2009 to have essentially another New Deal, to have economic reforms that would have matched the New Deal and their imagination and their ambition. We have lost that opportunity, and it may take another financial crisis to have an opportunity like that. But the good news is these are not deeply rooted beliefs. If someone memorizes a talking point to give in 10 minutes in a committee hearing, they don't have a deeply rooted belief in that. They are easily dissuaded or persuaded to another set of talking points. One difference for those of you who believe in modern monetary theory may be the deep commitment to deficit reduction, or that worry about the debt, that was how you're seen as serious in Washington, as you puff yourself up. And you wring your hands about the debt. But for the most part, there's very little depth to any of this. And there is not kind of an incumbent establishment around certain issues that there was in 2016. The 2016 election, I read Hillary Clinton's position papers on economic issues. One is on stock buybacks, where she described the problem perfectly, and her solution, and I say her, there was a policy apparatus, you know who they were. The solution was to require more frequent disclosure of stock buybacks. That is like the pill that Mother gives you in the Jefferson Airplane song. It doesn't do anything at all. And they didn't want to cross Wall Street. They didn't want to cross the substantial establishment that supported the buybacks. I think that things are disrupted now, and there is the potential to come forward with much more aggressive policies than were certainly possible in 2016, or for a long time before that. And there are Democratic potential presidential candidates who already are there or are looking for things to be for, and that is a tremendous opportunity for much more imaginative policies that did not fit the previous orthodoxy. And second, I think there has to be an effort to get different people involved. We've got to have different people behind the doors when the doors close and the real decisions are made. And there was an effort like that in 2015 and 2016 that I was loosely part of. We were getting some friendly noises from some in the Clinton campaign that would presumably have had a role in the Clinton transition, but I also had the impression that their hearts were not really in it. If we don't get different people with a different point of view, then I think we're going to have another set of policies like the ones that we've had before. Is that should we questions, or do we have time for that? All right, okay. Thank you.
If I could just begin, I want to say, on behalf of myself, I worked for Henry Royce, who was chair of the Banking Committee in the House. Pat Malloy is here, worked for Bill Proxmire, who was chair of banking in the Senate. You would certainly have been more at home in that company. But on the other hand, we need you now. So
I'm not there now.
Well, you're
I'm
still
doing
with
other
us.
things.
You're still with us, and you're in the spirit that both of us know from an earlier time.
My sense is things have changed, and I don't know. I do know a lot of the reasons they've changed. I don't know how to make them change back.
I also want to thank you for the first ever reference at an EPS symposium to Jefferson Airplane. And on that note,
what about oversight? Hi, Dan Frumkin from White House Watch. What about oversight? Is there positive potential in the next few years for useful oversight, and if so, where would you direct it?
It has to begin immediately. I've read the articles in the last couple of days. There was an article by or column by Henry Littman in the New York Times this morning that I think does kind of give the quick cold shower that sending a subpoena does not mean you'll get the information requested. And I've been discouraged a little bit by the number of Democrats who are saying, well, we won't lead with investigations. You've got to lead with investigations because it is too easy to play out the clock. And this was also an issue I worked on. I was chairman of the Investigations and Oversight Subcommittee of the Science Committee and worked with the Judiciary Committee and with the House leadership on enforcing the subpoenas to Harriet Miers and to Josh Bolten. They're essentially, as the Harry Littman piece this morning said correctly, there are essentially three ways. One is criminal contempt, which is very similar to contempt of court. I mean, you subpoenaed something, they ignored your subpoena, that's contempt. But it requires prosecution by the executive branch. That's a big problem. The second is the traditional, and he seemed to think this was constitutionally suspect, but in fact is well grounded, is inherent contempt. That Congress it's comparable to civil contempt by a court. It's for to enforce compliance with the subpoena, and the effect of that is that somebody could be taken into custody and locked up until they do what they're supposed to do, until they obey the subpoena, or a court says under habeas corpus challenge that no, they're within their rights. And then the third is what we did in 2007, 2008, which was file a declaratory judgment action, get the court to issue its own subpoena, and then the court can enforce that. The problem with that, as Littman says, is that it does take time, so I think we need to get started now. I think the committees need to be sending letters now saying we're not in the majority yet, but we will be, and this is what we're going to ask you for. We're asking for this from you now, and if we don't get it, we'll subpoena you quickly, and then we'll try to expedite the proceedings. But yes, I think that there's a wide range. I mean, I think every group in Washington is coming up with their list of what they want investigated, and it's not just Russia, Russia, Russia. And I'm sure that there are folks who would be very interested in your ideas for avenues for inquiry, but it needs to start soon. The Miers-Bolten lawsuit wasn't filed until 2008, and even with the proceedings expedited, there was not enough time to get a decision back within that Congress. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, thank you very much for your presentation. I was wondering, from your own personal and professional experience, how do priorities and key policies within the Democratic caucus in Congress get established? Get decided?
Decided. Well, that was sort of what I did. And I guess the gist of what I just said is they aren't really, or they aren't decided by the rank and file members. They are decided more by leadership and senior staff. And when your party is in control, to a large extent by the administration. But I think that the other article in the last couple of days is that Pelosi is still dealing with the prospect that there would be enough members who would not vote for her, enough Democrats who would not vote for her on the floor, that she can't become Speaker, in which case things are in turmoil in the Democratic leadership for some time. I think that one of the reasons that there is an opportunity now to come forward with pretty imaginative ideas is that they aren't going to pass anyway. So you might as well propose them with the knowledge that they aren't going to pass. When I was in the state legislature, anything I introduced might get passed. That was a lot of pressure. I had to figure out whether it made sense or whether there was something wrong with it. And when I was in the House as a Democrat, when there's a Republican in the majority, I didn't feel that pressure. I could introduce something that I thought was worth talking about. But now's the time, perhaps. I just mentioned to Stephanie a minute ago that John Yarmouth is a smart guy. He's going to be and someone who I think thinks heart is in the right place. He'll be the Democratic chair of the Budget Committee. There's an opportunity to talk about setting spending priorities that don't assume that, oh my God, we can't burn up the deficit. It's a crime against our children. What we usually hear about those topics. Yes.
Hi, I'm Steve Grumbine. I'm with Real Progressives, and I want to thank you for your words today. I guess first things first, thank you very much for bringing up modern monetary theory. Okay. And second thing is, you said that the vast majority of these individuals are about thimble deep when it comes to the ideological, yes, inclinations. And you also made mention that we had an opportunity for a New Deal under Obama that went the wayside. How much pressure could activists within this culture right now impact the ability to start advancing a far more aggressive dismantling of the Volcker rule, et cetera, and really, really pressuring on fiscal policy so that we can see a New Deal?
Yeah, I think things have changed. In the 2008 race, both Obama and Clinton were positioning themselves to be sensible centrist, and people didn't believe it of either one of them because she was a woman, he was African American. Diversity is how we judge how progressive someone is now. John Edwards, who is demographically very like me, we were born a month apart in adjoining counties. The problem with John Edwards was that in 2004 he had run as the Southern pro-business centrist, and then in 2008 he was trying to move left of both Clinton and Obama. He did everything short of saying the Internationale at campaign rallies to try to move to the left, and no one believed it. So there was not really a credible candidate in 2008 who was making those arguments, and the arguments didn't seem as important. We didn't have the sense of how badly things had gone wrong that I think we have had since the 2008 crisis. I think all of the candidates, those who now have credibility on these issues and those who don't, some of whom are very much acting like John Edwards, trying to move quickly to the left, despite a history that is not consistent with that. And I think both. Yeah, I polled a lot of the financial reform issues towards the end of the time I was in Congress. I thought, since I've done all this stuff, maybe I ought to see if people liked it, and they liked it. They liked the idea of breaking up the biggest banks, and the rationale given for that in the poll question was they have too much power. And we don't want to let them. We don't want to have to bail them out again. Overwhelmingly, it's just hugely popular. The problem was nobody believed it. They didn't believe. They knew me a little bit, but I wasn't the national figure they saw on the news every night. I think both Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren have credibility already. They are authentic on this issue. And then the question is whether anyone believes what others say. But they're looking for issues that will differentiate themselves from others in the field. And I think the average consultant is entirely caught up in, what set of personal characteristics are we looking for? Do we want an Asian African-American woman? Do we want a African-American former mayor? I mean, or a Latino mayor, not really looking at the policy issues, but there is a policy debate there with a couple of people who are likely in the field who are very credible on the issues now already. Cookie.
So this is a follow-up question. This is a follow-up question.
Okay.
I'm in your camp completely. I think we should call the new Democratic program New Deal 2.0 or 21st Century New Deal or something like that. Medicare for All is a New Deal idea. They would have done it, except Roosevelt didn't think he could follow through and wanted to
he thought he
protect
could between Social Security and
exactly. And I've heard this from many people. I go to Politics in Prose, to book talks, and the liberal wing of the Democratic people like Dean Baker, for example.
Like who?
Dean Baker. He's the head of I forget what it's
Baker.
called.
Yes.
They give they give a talk, sort of espousing New Deal types of things. There was another talk at the AFL-CIO last year, and I go up and I say, well, you're really agreeing with Bernie Sanders, aren't you? And I was a Bernie Sanders person. Yeah. And they look confused and upset, and they say, well, no. Like, who could ever consider someone like that? Or Elizabeth Warren. And I was a fan of Elizabeth Warren from the day she published the bankruptcy study about medical expenses. Why do they do that? Why do they just simply write off Bernie Sanders like he comes from the moon, and Elizabeth Warren because she's too shrill? I mean, even Rubin doesn't care for Elizabeth Warren, and I don't understand why not.
And actually, ill-advisedly, he has used the word shrill, and it has been explained to him that is not a good thing to say about a woman. And I think he's not saying shrill anymore. He's probably saying strident. I don't know all the reasons. I think that there is an establishment. That's not just something that people outside of politics who don't know it just say. There's a policy establishment, and they are very protective of their own turf, their own status. I think most people thought. I didn't take a position in the 2016 election. If Warren had run, with whom I worked pretty closely on a lot of issues, I would have supported her. I was very pleased with Bernie's campaign. But I started out, as most people did, I think including Warren, and I think including Bernie, thinking he'd be a message candidate, that he'd be the Dennis Kucinich of 2016. And Dennis, no disrespect to Dennis, but he never, he never broke above 5%. But Bernie got 43% of primary vote and 47% of the pledged delegates. I think if he'd started out thinking, I might really win this sucker, he might really have won that sucker. And I think Warren would have. And she decided that she was getting enough discouragement from the people who seemed to know that. And I don't know. I never talked to her about it, so I don't know what all the thinking was. Making a decision to run for office or not, and I've made both decisions, is a pretty big personal thing. But yeah, we're going to hear that. We're going to, and I'm very skeptical. I'm very cynical about the descriptions of people's personalities, because what we think of someone aligns greatly with what we think of their politics. And I think that there's been a pretty organized effort to call Elizabeth Warren a difficult personality. I know her pretty well. Maybe it's a reflection of how difficult my personality is. Actually, the great phrase of the establishment particularly the Geithner Treasury and the Obama and the, I should say, Rahm Emanuel White House, as team player. Yeah, I wasn't a team player. They thought I was a team player. I was playing for a different team. I was playing for Elizabeth Warren's team and Sheila Bair's team. I was playing for the girls' team. But that's the kind of it becomes personal in all their personal attacks. In Southern politics, and maybe this is true in the rest of the country, in the African American community now, one of the methods to judge, or one of the bases for judging white candidates, is do they feel comfortable with black people? And I thought we all grew up in the South. We've known people since we were knee high to African Americans, and then I saw the clip of Mitt Romney with a group of African American men. I thought, he is going to jump out of his skin. But that is something that the establishment political activists, African American political operatives, say that about the politicians they don't support. Oh, he's not comfortable with black people.
Okay. On that note, Congressman, thank you very, very much.